Hey everybody, this is Frank McDonough. Welcome to Plant Information class, where I go over some of the questions and problems and uh, queries that I get over the course of the last month. This month, we're looking at a lot of burn damage from trees that were involved, trees and shrubs that were involved in the fire, and we'll go through that and see how to evaluate things when they're burned. And we're also going to look at a episode of Gardens of California from 2006 where I give a lecture on the history of roses. Really interesting stuff in there. And also I have a little blurb about what to plant in March and April, what kind of vegetables that is you can plant in March and April. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and here we go. Okay, this is a tree. It's a Ficus benjamina, actually, which are usually small house plants or sometimes hedges, but this one has turned into a monster. It's a beautiful tree. Um, the question was, what's going on with my tree? And you can notice here, this close-up shows a cut branch, but there seems to be something coming around there. Now, that something coming around there could be one of two things. It could be a branch that somehow turned around and came up the back, or it could be a root. These things will develop aerial roots. In fact, you can see these aerial roots coming down here. Look at that. And sometimes those aerial roots, they'll wrap around the tree. They call them strangling roots. Now, that's not exactly the whole entire thing that's happening here. You notice you have some bark coming off here. This could be from rats. And here's another interesting thing you have here. Look at this thing right here, huh? That thing. That is apparently some kind of a gall, maybe a crown gall that's growing. So it's got crown gall, it's got strangling roots, it has rat damage. Is this thing going to survive? Well, if you look at the entire thing, there's another picture of that gall, by the way. Beautiful. That's a beautiful gall. And another picture, but here's the tree. And this tree's kind of doomed, unfortunately. It's got more problems than just those. One of its biggest problems is it's bifurcate. In other words, it's got two collateral sides, two equal sides right there. And if you look closer, it's not just bifurcate, but look at that. That's a fissure right there. There's a fissure right there. There's another fissure here. These are all weak spots where the bark is ingrown, and that tree can split into two or four or who knows how many pieces if it gets enough wind. So what happens is when you prune these trees back, like once you head them, it looks like this has been headed right around here. If you head them, then they get kind of thick. They also, if you trim them where you're taking canopy off like this, you actually cause the center of gravity to go up. And what this causes is it causes these two bifurcate branches to start basically oscillating in opposite directions of each other. And that causes a heck of a lot of pressure and force right there on that very weak kind of bifurcate crotch there. Poor thing. It'll just split in two. And plus, here's another thing. You could, if you wanted to, you could keep cutting this back every couple of years. That's called a pollard. It really requires that you do keep cutting it back every 2 to 3 years. Don't let these branches that it'll start growing new branches. They'll originate right there where you cut them, and those new branches will be very weak where they are attached. And so to get around that, you keep cutting those branches back so new ones grow both where that branch came from and on those branches. And that kind of keeps it from getting too large and causing this to sway and break itself. Now, the problem is that when you do that, you cause a lot more root growth than normal. There's some damage happening here already to the sidewalk from the root growth. If you cut it back like that every 2 to 3 years, especially a ficus, it's going to grow a fantastic amount of roots, much more than it normally does. And that's because what stimulates new root growth is new leaf growth. So you get these new leaves growing, they produce a hormone that causes the roots to grow. And uh, it's a never ending kind of vicious cycle. And whichever way you slice it, it's not going to do very well no matter how you try. So it's just probably a good idea, unfortunately, to take this tree out. Okay, this is a set of photos that was sent to me by Sarah, who was unfortunately a victim of the Eaton Canyon fire, and she wanted to know if these trees are salvageable. Um, this is a pine tree. I'm not sure what kind of pine tree. It's tough to say whether pine trees uh, are going to make it or not. However, I'm looking at the base of this pine tree. It is pretty severely burned. Um, this is where I would take the pine tree down, unfortunately. You may leave it there if it's not a danger, if it's going to, if its failure is going to result in zero injuries and damages, then you might just leave it up and see what happens. The problem with this is you invite boring beetles and other insects that are going to attack the trees. And once they're in this tree, they're going to become a problem for other trees like it. So I'd say take that tree down. Right here, we have what looks like a hedge. I don't know exactly what the hedge was, possibly a prunus, but this hedge, it's hard to say. I'm looking at the base right there, and you can see on that base that it's almost intact. It looks like mostly just the top burned. You might try just cutting that in half. I mean, I should say, cutting that where you're going about half the height of the wall there and see what happens. However, I'd start, if it was me, I'd just tear them out and start fresh. And whatever that fruit tree, whatever this fruit tree is here, or whatever this tree is here, doesn't look too good. Again, sometimes you just can't tell a tree's on fire. If you don't see any obviously charred tissue at the near the base up until about 3-4 feet, you might want to cut it back. If that's a citrus tree, whitewash it and see what happens. Now, I'm not sure what kind of trees these are, but I can tell you that the base of these things is burned badly. That would invite both insects and fungal diseases, which in turn could affect other trees in the area. I would definitely take these out. And again, I don't know exactly what this is. It may be a juniper, looks like a juniper hedge. I would take that out. Just it's planted too close to begin with. That's the problem. If you look how close these are, that is way too close. That causes a lot of stress on these things. Uh, I would not. I'd tear them out. Same thing with all these. These are badly charred. I'd take those out as well. Well, I hope this is helpful. I'm sorry for the bad news, and I'm really sorry for the pain that you're going through, and I hope everything comes out okay. Thanks. Hi, I'm Frank McDonough, botanical information consultant here at the Arboretum, and this is a yard I was sent pictures of to at least give them somewhat of an idea about what's going on with these trees that have been affected by the fire, unfortunately. So let's take a look. This one right here is a citrus tree. I was sent some pictures of some citrus, and I was kind of amazed. If you look at this citrus tree right here, it's practically untouched. This one too, practically untouched. These two, untouched. This one here has some singeing on the outer leaves. The inner leaves are green, and the fruit seems to be okay too, which is interesting. Now, somebody asks about, is the fruit any good after the fire? Well, yes. There's been several studies done with fires like this and citrus, and it was found that the amount of pollutants that the citrus absorbs is incredibly small, and that's mostly because the only pollutants that are in the air are airborne. They're airborne pollutants, A, so they can't get through the thick rind. And B, if any of that was to get into the tree, it would have to go through the roots first, and that takes a month to 3 months for that to happen. So it generally doesn't happen because if these are ripe fruit, best you can do is just, is harvest them so they don't stay in the tree for more than a month or two. But even after a month or two, they're going to be no good to harvest anyway. So it's no problem with the contamination in the fruit. Here's another one. This looks like it's toast, but it's not. Just the outer leaves have singed and burned. The inner leaves are still green. Same with this one too. The inner leaves are still green, and even on it's like one side's a little bit more burnt than the others. This thing should come back just fine. So what's amazing is it's amazing it's not. These trees are actually Mediterranean plants. Uh, I no, they're not Mediterranean. I'm sorry. They're from areas that get water only one part of the year, and the rest of the year they're dry. And so they're very good at dealing with adverse conditions. And some of those adverse conditions in these areas, these are monsoonal areas, they do have forest fires and land fires and fires that go through these forests and understories where these grow in the wild. And they are quite resistant to fire. This one just it looks great. The little on the left is needs to be trimmed off, but other than that, it's fine. And this one came out like a champ. Some of the leaves came off, but still got its green leaves. And I would recommend. It doesn't look like the trunk was singed, but just to be on the safe side, go ahead and whitewash it with 1/2 white latex interior paint and 1/2 water. Same thing goes with the one in the back there. And yeah, that thing just came out like a champ. This tree unfortunately didn't. Now I can't tell exactly how much damage is done to this. Um, it's a rather tall tree. If it falls, it can cause some. Well, it can cause some problems for people working there. Uh, I would probably take it out. Just it's it its chances of recovery may be good or maybe bad. It's tough to tell, but it seems to be pretty singed in the middle there. And the trunk, and this you can't tell here, but the trunk on this is okay. However, I'm worried about the middle part, which appeared singed. I can't tell on this one because of the the contrast. Now, is that the same one? Let's see. Yeah, this is the same one. Okay, this trunk is fine. It looks like the rest of the tree is fine. So go ahead and leave that there and see what happens. Wait till about June, see how the leaves are doing. If it's sprouting if it's sprouting leaves like crazy, don't worry about it. If you're getting a few coming here and there, but it doesn't look too good, then you might want to take it out. Same tree, I do believe. And this one too. This one is it may be okay down below, but up here it looks pretty singed. I'd take that out. Down below again, down below it's fine. Up above a cinch. Now this is the last one here. This one is toast, and you've got peeling bark from top to bottom. It looks like it was right next to a house, and I heard somebody say that more houses burn trees than vice versa. So, oh, another citrus. Forgot about this one. This one's fine. It's going to do great. And these. Oh, I do believe I'm just re, uh, rehashing the same. So really interesting how these citrus just did fine through that, and some of the deciduous trees, the ones close to the house where the house could reflect heat at them, did not. This is an oak tree that has some problems. This is a person in Glendale, and she was really worried about this tree, and I don't blame her. You can see its canopy on that's like about 50%, maybe a little less, but about 50%. Let's take a look at some more of the tree. There's another angle at that. You can see that you can see the whole tree. The canopy is almost see-through. There's another one. You see the sun shining through the tree. Um, what gives? Is this an unhealthy tree? Well, let's take a quick look at a close-up. Now the leaves don't look too bad, but they're not very thick. There's not a lot of them on there. What's going on? Could it be this? Look at that. Somebody nailed some steps onto the tree. Probably not. It looks like they've been there for years. This tree, by the way, looks like it's probably almost over 100 years old. Most of the houses in this tract are not. So this tree was built on, and it's doing pretty well for a tree that's been built on. Let's take a look and see if we can find anything wrong with the tree. This bark and the wood look fine. No noticeable problems. You can see where some branches have been cut. However, I don't see any indication of disease there. These look like they're healing quite nicely, both of them. So I went to Google Earth, I'm sorry, Google Maps, and I looked at Google Street View, and I looked at uh, an older one. This is 2008 Google Street View at this area, and take a look there. It's very thick there. The tree is very thick, and this is a more recent version. This is 2019 or 20, and you can see that that tree has thinned quite a bit since then. Let's take a look from on top and see what we can see. Now, you look at here, this is 2011. You can see there's the oak tree right there, and there's the house it's next to. And you notice that in the next one, this house has changed a little bit. And the next one after that, it's changed quite a bit. Looks like this was almost a rebuilt house. So you had a lot of activity going on. It looks like this backyard and this looks like lawn has stretched into the area underneath the oak. The oak, even in this picture, which was fairly recent, looks pretty darn thick. So this thinning happened just recently and I talked to the person whose oak it was, and she said, yeah, this happened over the last couple of years. What gives? Well, found out. This is what gives. The area underneath the oak had been, besides the construction going on next door, the area had been kind of cleaned up and gravel put underneath the tree, as well as some tool sheds. So what this means is this tree only really has a small open area down there, maybe about 1/3 of the area underneath the canopy, or at least the historic canopy. When this happens, this puts this tree under a lot of stress. Add to that, not just this stress, but oaks really need to have their own leaves falling down underneath them and decaying, because they've evolved millions of years to develop leaves that produce elements when they decay that help feed those microorganisms in the soil that are most beneficial to the oak. In other words, it's kind of evolved to feed itself quite well with its own leaves. If you take those leaves away from the tree, you're starving the tree. You're basically starving the micronutrient, microflora and biota down there that really needs those oak tree leaves to exist. And this oak tree needs that microflora for it to exist. So you take it out and you're starving the tree. Plus, there's some compaction involved with all these sheds and everything. So my advice was, and they were watering it twice a week, which is not a good thing. You don't want to water an oak at all during the rainy season. Maybe once or twice in the spring, and then starting in the midsummer, not at all until about October, because they go dormant. And when they're dormant and you water them, you're not feeding that water to the oak. You're feeding that water to the fungi that decay the oak's roots. So my advice is take out all that gravel, take out the sheds, lightly rake the soil underneath the canopy of the oak, and let the oak's leaves fall underneath it and accumulate from now until, who knows. You never really want to take those oak leaves away. They are feeding that oak and keeping it healthy. Also, do not water that oak unless it's a drought year. And if it's a drought year, you can water it maybe once a month for 2 months, the months of April and May, or May and June, but nothing past mid-June. You do not want to water that oak when it's dormant. If you do that, you're feeding the fungus that feeds on the roots and not the roots. So, what should you be planting out in the vegetable garden in March and April? Well, I made a list for you. Take a look.
Today's lecture is about roses. We're going to talk about the fascinating history of roses in human affairs and how they came to be. Roses are ancient plants. They're about 35 million years old. 35 million years old. They're some of the oldest flowering plants. The flowering plants came to be around the time of the dinosaurs. Before that, it was just cone-bearing plants. And if you look at, we're going to come up with some pictures here in just a second of these roses. The rose petals were 5-petaled roses. The flowers looked a little different, but the leaves of these rose plants looked almost the same as modern roses. I mean, you can take a look at a modern rose leaf and a regular rose leaf, and it's almost, a fossil rose leaf, it's almost the same thing. The fossil and a modern rose next to each other, the only difference would be that the rose petals are a little different looking, but there's still 5 of them. So these ancient roses have been found in fossils in Oregon and in Ohio, and it just points to the fact that they've been with us for an awful long time. Roses in the ancients, mankind, of course, went through certain stages, and with them came the flowers. There's a lot of controversy when man first started using flowers ceremoniously, in ceremony and in ritual. There was a burial of Neanderthal men in Europe that had flower pollen at the burial site, but there was some debate as to whether that flower pollen was there because Neanderthals put it there or because mice that were eating the other things that were at the burial site, like the Neanderthals, brought it in. So there's a little bit of controversy as to whether that flower pollen represented flowers actually being put on the grave. But hunter-gatherer societies did have a lot of respect for the plants around them. And although we don't know exactly when roses started being used in ceremonies, they most certainly were in ancient times. And some of the earliest use of roses that's documented in ancient times is with the Minoan society, which is the island of Crete, the Greeks, the Egyptians. So all of these societies used roses. That pentagram you see behind me, the pentagram is thought to have been inspired by the 5-petaled rose and the 5, if you look at a rose calyx, which is the part right underneath the petals, it's almost just like a pentagram. It has 5 star points just like that, and that's a very ancient symbol. It's thought the rose inspired that symbol. Now, yes, the ancients used roses, and at the time of the ancients there was rose cultivation going on. Attar of rose and rose water were being produced by the Greeks, by the Phoenicians and other societies. This was a great trade item, and I'll tell you why just a little later. But the society that brought roses, that really overdid roses, roses in everything they did, was the Romans. The Romans used roses in cooking, they used roses in ceremony, they used roses in religious rites. The rose had a great significance for many reasons. One of them was that it was the flower of Venus, and it represented love. One of the other parts about the rose that was very fascinating was the idea of the rose there'd be a rose in an area, in a house, a Roman house. It would be hung upside down, and whatever was said underneath that rose stayed there. It was said sub rosa, which means that it was said under the rose. If you said anything underneath a rose that was hung up in a house, that means you kept secret about it. You kept quiet. And the Romans did love conspiracies. They loved conspiracies. They loved the idea of fidelity, the idea of keeping a secret, being loyal to those to whom you were loyal to. And so this symbol of the rose hung upside down in the room was very, very powerful symbol for them. Another thing that the Romans used roses for was as a deodorant. Attar of rose, which was distilled from roses that were grown in Bulgaria and Egypt, was a very powerful scent. In fact, you couldn't stand it by itself because it was so overpowering. So what you would do was you would dilute it and make rose water. Well, it was that rose water that was ubiquitous in Roman society. Everybody used it. It was a deodorant. You put it in your bath. You put it in your food. It was just used all over. And because of that, the Roman society probably stayed together. Remember, Rome toward the end and from the middle and the end of the empire was aggregating peoples from all over the area. And when these people came into Rome, they came in with their own body odors, their own scents, their own smells. And so in order for society to function, they had to have some kind of a deodorant. So rose water, roses are responsible for the Roman Empire lasting as long as it did. Very interesting facet about roses. Now, after the Roman Empire collapsed, not much was happening with roses in Europe. They were kept in monasteries and sacred gardens. They were also grown by apothecaries because roses were used as a flavoring and somewhat of a medicine. So if you were in Dark Ages Europe and you were sick and you needed some root of some kind to feel better, you needed some, any kind of medicine that stunk. For instance, valerian. Valerian root is a sedative that's been used since Roman times. It's been used in medieval times. Apothecaries carried it. Well, valerian smells like rotten socks. Very bad, stinky socks. Terrible smell to it. So if you were an apothecary, you'd take the rose and the rose water and you'd mix it in with the valerian so it would become palatable to your clients. Even though in Europe roses were coming out of favor, a lot of rose varieties that may have been grown in Rome were lost. In China, roses were blooming. The Chinese were horticultural pioneers. In the AD 1000s, they developed very, very complicated, complex horticultural techniques. One of the things they did that was very interesting is they took the technique of grafting. Now, grafting was developed before the Roman Empire, believe it or not, and it was made possible by the use of brass knives. Before you had a sharp metal knife, you wouldn't have been able to make a graft on a tree. And whoever developed grafting, they must have been a genius, because just to make that leap from, in nature you'll see grafts here and there on trees, but to make that leap and actually do one yourself, that must have been something. But it's not possible without a sharp knife, and sharp knives really weren't available until the Bronze Age, and that's when grafting actually developed. Well, the Chinese took this one further, and they started grafting not just fruit trees, but other ornamentals as well, including roses. And they started to graft roses, and this allowed them to create many different varieties. In fact, one of the famous ones is the China rose and the tea rose. Now, these are roses that come from different parts of China, and they're not as cold hardy as the European roses, but they have one advantage, and that is that they bloom more frequently. So instead of having 2 blooms at the most, maybe one in the fall and one in the spring, if you're lucky, on most of the European roses, the Chinese roses bloomed on and off through a good period of time. So this will be important just a little bit later. Come the age of reason, the Renaissance, I'm sorry. Let me talk about roses in the Muslim world too. The Muslims helped keep roses in cultivation that would have been lost because they had such a high regard for gardens. Gardens were considered a representation of paradise, and it was almost an obligation for every rich Muslim to build a garden and to have roses in it. Native Americans and roses. At this time, Native Americans didn't really have roses that they were using as ornament. In their hunter-gatherer society, they didn't really have a sense of using flowers to a great degree for ornamentation, but they did use roses as food. Several different types of roses were used as food by the Native Americans. And an interesting story about Native Americans being introduced to roses, that was first done in Mexico, and it was the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And in that story, roses figure prominently, in that the rose that miraculously appeared from the serape of the hero in the story was a rose that heretofore hadn't been grown in the New World. And that rose was then called the Seville rose. I'm sorry, that rose is the same rose as Rosa Gallica, which was grown in Rome and was the apothecary rose. Amazing, how that was introduced through that myth or that story, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and very. I said before that, roses were not thought of as ornamentation at all. Now, in Europe, things were changing for roses. The Renaissance had come, and roses were considered okay one more time. Before that, they were considered sinful, along with just about any other expression of beauty. Roses were now being appreciated, and the race to develop new roses started just about the time of the Renaissance. And one of the things that helped increase and really bring about an explosion in the interest of roses by Europeans were the new roses that were being brought from China. Remember, I talked to you earlier that China had been cultivating many different types of roses that were very different from European roses. They had more frequent bloom, the blooms were larger, the plants themselves were actually quite ugly looking, but the blooms were very, very big, very spectacular, and the blooming period was very frequent. And so when these roses are starting to be brought over from China, rose breeders really started amping up their efforts to produce bigger and better roses. Now, of course, during that time, the Age of Empire, the Age of Reason, all these different early ages in European before the 20th century, there wasn't a huge market at that time for roses. It wasn't until probably around the 1700s, 1700s, that the cut flower market was starting to use roses. Now, remember our friends the Dutch, the Dutch are just fantastic people. They've always been very innovative horticultural pioneers. The Dutch had, were growing roses as cut flowers as well. Unfortunately, roses as cut flowers didn't really make headway until the 1800s. Roses were still kind of the area of the rich. In fact, one of the associations of the rose, one of the most powerful associations, is that of wealth. There's a song, a very popular song that goes, "I never promised you a rose garden," i.e., I never promised you things would be great and I'd have all this money, etc. Having a rose garden meant that you had a certain amount of wealth. It required somebody to be out there to take care of it. It required lots of cultivation. It was a big drag on money and resources, and that was the case until about the late 1800s, early 1900s. And a couple of things changed. One was that roses were used in the language of roses, of flowers. The language of flowers was a way that Victorian people would communicate with each other, especially men and women, and use flowers instead of words to relay their feelings with each other. And in the Victorian era, it was very frowned upon to be emotional, to wear your heart on your sleeve, and so you used flowers to express how you felt about somebody. So of course, the classic is the red rose, which meant passionate love. Then there was the yellow rose, which meant, we're just friends. The pink rose, that either meant things are warming up or you're somebody I love in a platonic way. And then there's my favorite, the dried white rose. That was a rather obscure language of flowers representation. That meant if you were a man and you were trying to charm some young lady and she gave you a bouquet of dried white roses, that meant you didn't stand a chance in heck. So just remember that if you ever want to get rid of somebody, and just send them dried white roses, and if they're from the Victorian era, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Now, the hybrid tea started to become more and more popular after the turn of the century. What is the hybrid tea? The hybrid tea is a hybrid of the tea rose from China with other roses to make it more robust. And the first hybrid tea was called La France, and La France was developed in 1861. That's really, before that, there were many rose breeders. Rose breeding took different types of roses and crossed them to see if they could get a better rose. But this particular cross really started a race. It started a race to find the biggest, most perfect, longest lasting, longest stem rose. And that race actually kind of went to ridiculous extremes after a while. In fact, it probably reached a peak in the 60s and 70s with roses such as New Century and others that were huge, huge, long-lasting, big flowers, but didn't have any scent at all. In fact, one of the byproducts, one of the problems with doing this rose breeding is that a lot of times desirable traits like scent were bred out of the rose. And so since the 80s, the late 80s, there's been a change in that. And roses have been bred more and more, A, to have more smell to them, to be more rose-like in their fragrance, and B, to even look more like the old-fashioned roses. Instead of having that upside-down spinning top-shaped fine bud, a lot of roses that are sold now on the market are more open and relaxed. They're flat, cabbage-shaped, more like the old-fashioned roses. That's becoming more and more popular, and that's driving the rose breeding market. The Rose Parade is another local display of our affection for roses. The origin of the Rose Parade is kind of interesting. In the late 1800s, there was a diaspora of Easterners these are very wealthy Easterners from the East Coast. They came here for either health reasons, or they came here to make a ton of money because land and real estate and oil were very big. And as a result, there's a very exclusive community in Pasadena. This community had its exclusive club, and that was the Valley Hunt Club. Still exists today, still in part very active with the Rose Parade. But they decided, they were always tired, they were getting tired of their East Coast brethren kind of looking down on them, saying, oh, there you are in California, you know, we're here where the real class is, you know, you guys are out in La La Land. I mean, that same attitude that you hear today, you know, California's the land of fruits and nuts. They couldn't stand hearing that. So they decided to rub it in to the people in the East Coast, and they had the Rose Parade, and that was the beautiful rose-covered floats in the middle of January when everybody else that they knew on the East Coast was freezing. It was really, they're just rubbing that right in with the Rose Parade. Well, it was also a great, you know, they weren't doing that just for revenge. It was nice. But the other reason they did it for was to boost Southern California and boost income to their investments as well. And it's just a great and a fascinating parade. And there's like, I think the first Rose Parade had a couple of 100,000 people watching it. No, 10 to 20,000, I'm sorry. And these days, you have 2 or 3 million people. So it was a spectacular success. And not only was it a success for real estate, boosterism, etc., but it really gave people an idea of what you could do horticulturally in Southern California. You know, a lot of the flowers in the Rose Parade, especially in the early years, were grown in Southern California. Nowadays, it's not so much the case. A lot of them still are, but quite a few are also brought in from all over the world to increase the variety. Another thing that happened in the mass market, I was talking about how things changed and how people, you know, a rose garden used to be something special. You had to be rich to afford one. Well, back in the turn of the century, they found a way to mass market roses. One of the pioneers of this, by the way, was a gentleman named Armstrong, who founded, among other things, Armstrong Garden Centers and Armstrong Roses. He was a transplant from Canada, where it was bitterly cold. He came here, he worked in the nursery industry, and he kind of got out of the nursery industry almost because of a huge windstorm that came about. And so he decided to get into something different. He got into growing roses. And he found out, because we have a longer season here, that you can grow roses for a longer period of time. And you get bigger plants. And so you had a competitive product. Plus the railroads are out here now, and you could sell your product by taking it on the railroads. What is the future of roses? We looked at the past and how they come. Well, right, these days, lots of people grow roses in their backyards, their front yards. Having a rose garden isn't the trouble it used to be. And there are many fine rose gardens out there where you can see just roses, including at the Huntington and at the Sconsel Gardens. One of the interesting things that's happening with roses is the introduction of genetic engineering into roses. And in fact, the Suntory company, which makes whiskey in Japan, in partnership with another company, has produced just recently the first blue rose. Now, this has been a dream of many people for a long time. True blue is a color that is not present in roses. It's present in some things like Meconopsis, which is called a wind poppy, and a few other plants. But true blue is a very rare color in plants, and they have bred a true blue rose. The problem is they haven't gotten the bugs out yet, there's still a problem in that the other pigments are still in the rose, the pink and the red pigments. So it doesn't look true blue, it looks blue with red in it, and they're working on it. So one of these days you'll be able to go into a flower shop and buy a rose that's blue, and not a fading blue rose or a rose that's been dyed, but an actual blue rose, and give that to your honey. So that's the lecture for today.